Well, I see by the clock we have 7:30. We've achieved the appropriate time, so let us begin. And my name is James McKim. I am, as the notice the session said, the chair of the diversity committee for the Church of New Hampshire. I'm also the Province 1 representative for the Episcopal Church Executive Council on Anti-Racism. And we hold these webcasts every once in a month as part of our Exploring Multicultural Awareness and Nurturing Cultural Competency series of webcasts. We have different topics every month, and this month's topic is Unpacking the Election. And so I know that you all have a great interest in this. We've brought together this webcast as a way to help us come together in Christ to be the Jesus movement. These webcasts are meant to be not so much didactic lectures, but conversations with people who have an expertise or experience in the topic area. So please feel free to type into the chat any of your thoughts, your questions, and I'll be looking at the chat, and others will be looking at the chat to pick up on the conversations and bring your thoughts into the actual conversation with our guests. And our guests tonight are the Right Reverend Nicholas Knisely from the Diocese of Rhode Island, the Right Reverend Doug Fisher from the Diocese of Western Massachusetts, and both of whom you can see on the screen. And also with us is the Right Reverend Robert Hirschfeld. He's actually going to be our spirits tracker, not being seen, but he'll be watching the chat very closely and keeping track of the spirit that is in the chat area. So thank you, bishops all, for being here tonight. This is a very challenging topic, and we know that emotions are running very high around it. And so before we begin, I'd like to offer the following prayer from Bishop Bruce O., who's president on behalf of the Council of Bishops of the United Methodist Church. Let us pray. Holy God, creator of us all, send your Spirit in peace, justice, and freedom upon us. Break down the walls of political partisanship and economic disparity, and make us one. Give us wisdom to walk in your ways. Remind us that your ways are not our ways. Teach that your power and might transcend the plans of every nation. Teach us again to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Amen.
Amen.
So, President-elect Donald J. Trump won the Electoral College. Secretary of State Hillary R. Clinton won the popular vote. Despite the hyperbole of commentators, one who said President-elect Trump crushed Secretary Clinton, both sides, both candidates really won only by slim margins. While the Electoral College has not officially pledged their votes, it is all but certain that President-elect Trump will become president. When you all registered for this session, we asked you to respond to the question, how have you seen the impact, the election impact in on you and in your community. The responses were many. I think if I had to sum them up, I'd just choose a couple which were representative of the rest. Anger, sadness, disbelief, next to exhilaration. Another comment was, I've seen this election confound and confuse so many people. The rancor and tone are upsetting to all, and so many to have a sense of loss no matter what the result of the vote was. So, bishops, I wonder if you'd spend about 5 minutes or so sharing your impressions of the impact as you've seen it, and what the results mean based on that impact that you've seen. So, Bishop Nicholas, start us off, please. What impact have you seen based on this election?
So, Rhode Island, like Massachusetts, is one of the few places in the country where, across most, if not all, demographic groups, it went for the Democratic candidate and voted for Secretary Clinton. There was one county in the center of the state that voted for Donald Trump, and I think the state split 60-40. I was in, just the way it worked out, I was in a church doing a visitation on Sunday that is in the county that voted for Donald Trump. And we talked a bit about what it was like in that congregation. And the congregation is incredibly nervous. Not about what's going to happen or what's going to happen in the nation at the moment. What they're really incredibly nervous about is how are they going to remain a community? It's a community that has prided itself on lifting up.
I think we lost a little audio.
Oh, are you not hearing me at all? Nope.
I hear you.
Now you're back.
Oh, I'm back?
Yes, you're back. Great.
Oh, good. I was about to say something profound. I'm afraid I just lost it. So.
We missed it.
So the community I was with was really struggling with how to remain a community, knowing that they are split right down the middle. And for people who are frightened and scared and angry about the surprise election, there are people who are excited and energized by this decision. These are people who've grown up with each other and have lived next door to each other for mostly their whole lives. It's a very stable working class community. And I was thinking about that as kind of a microcosm for what I'm hearing across the state. Somebody wrote online from Rhode Island that they had gone into a grocery store wearing a safety pin, and the young millennial clerk saw them and said, you know, you lost. Take the stupid safety pin off. And the person who I think was older just was sort of stunned by that reaction. It's not what I'm trying to say. I'm talking to people who are hurt by this. Well, it's stupid. You should take it off. You lost. Just deal with it. Let's get going. I think people who are among those who voted for the winner of the election, they do not understand the deep emotions that people who voted for Secretary Clinton are feeling. And I think they're deep and real. My own daughter, who's 23, it was incredibly hard for her. I don't know that she's got her feet back underneath her quite yet. We went into the night thinking things were going to turn out one way, and they didn't. I had an incredibly poignant conversation the morning after the election with a teacher at one of our private schools. And we were meeting before. I was teaching a class on the methods of knowing in a philosophy course. And she said, I took my children with me to the voting booth yesterday. I took a picture of my grandmother. I took a picture of my mother. I put them on the desk where I was voting. I had my children there to see it. We're historically going to vote for the first woman president, and then we're going to have a celebration as history was made, and they were going to be witness to it. And And then the election didn't go that way, and I started to cry, and my children cried, and we woke up this morning and we're still crying, and I need a hug. And I think that sort of in the raw moment of just disbelief and pain and deep sadness about what's come. Now that's all separate from sort of a real fear of what this means and what has been unleashed in the rhetoric of this election. And we've heard stories about two congregations around the country that have been defaced. And in the run-up to the election, there were other things like that happen. Two instances here in Rhode Island that have not made the press at all. We had picketers at one of our congregations that is led by a married lesbian priest. People with bullhorns marching up and down the sidewalk as people went to church. People we'd never heard of before or never knew. We don't even know for sure if they're from Rhode Island. And earlier in the fall, we had one of our churches tagged with a swastika on the side. A church has a primarily Latino congregation in Cranston, which is a working class area that voted for Donald Trump. That's out there. Beyond the Episcopal Church, I'm hearing concerns from the Muslim community in Rhode Island, and I'm told the Jewish community is very concerned about the implications of this election. And we haven't yet, as a statewide faith community, had a chance to gather to unpack this. But there's some work that people are going to have to do. First to grieve, then to figure out what the parameters are that we're managing, and then I think to start to plan for what response will look like. I think that's a good end.
And I think that's a great end too, and thank you for that. It certainly sounds as if in Rhode Island you're seeing much of the same thing that we're seeing in New Hampshire and in other places. So Bishop Doug, what are you seeing in your diocese as the impact?
Sure. Well, I come from the most blue of blue states in terms of Massachusetts, but where I serve as bishop, which is Western and Central Massachusetts, there's much more disagreement about things about that, not mostly in Worcester County. So when I read the questions that you referred to before, James, I thought that they were really well stated and expressed a lot of anxiety about two different things. One was about healing within congregation. And I would especially see that, say, in some congregations of mine in Worcester, where some people walked out on sermons yesterday or on Monday. And at the same, so one expression was, how do we have healing within our parish communities? The other expression was about fear for people who are immigrants, people who are refugees, people who are Muslim, people who are gay, lesbian, and there's a lot of expression in those questions about fear about that. And unfortunately, I've seen some of those fears come true as well. You know, we have Mount Tom here in Western Massachusetts in the Pioneer Valley, and that was the face with all kinds of graffiti. It was about a pro-Trump statement, then plus terrible things graffiti said about Jewish people, about people of color. On this coming Saturday, we're going to have a procession to that place on Mount Tom and have a prayer service there to reconsecrate the mountain. But it's so sad that we've got to go reconsecrate the mountain, isn't it? We've had some incidents in schools that are really hateful things that are said to people who are non-white. So the questions that people ask are very legitimate questions. But the thing I think that would connects both healing within our churches and healing within our society for those who are most vulnerable comes down to the baptismal covenant. You know, will you respect the dignity of every human being? And so that means in our own congregations, when we're speaking to someone who disagrees with us, whether it's Democrat or Republican, can we respect them for who they are? They're a child of God. And then in terms of our society, can we recognize that when we say, will you respect the dignity of every human being, it truly means every human being. Place the emphasis on every. And the other line I always go to is this wonderful line from Michael Curry. Michael Curry says, God is love, And if it's not about love, it's not about God. And if we can emphasize that within our church communities and within the social, political actions that we take, I think we'll be on a different course than we are at this present moment.
Right. Thank you. That's the God is love and love is God really rings true with me, and I'm sure with many people on the call. And we do need to live into our baptismal covenant. And I guess where I'd like to go next, and this is picking up on some of what I'm seeing in the chat as well, even with this discomfort that we're feeling and the fear that we have from the campaign and from afterwards, it's interesting to me that people seem to have voted wanting change above all else, change such that one commentator, I forget who it was, but said morality was lost in this election. So with that, with the incivility, with discomfort, with the fear, how do we deal with that? How do we heal that hurt? I mean, it's one thing to say God is love and love is God, but how do we get down to the next step? How do we get into the actual healing process? What are your thoughts on how we do that?
Yeah, I think we start with dealing with our own internal emotions and owning them and acknowledging them as real. There's an anger there. I have to admit that my prayer life has taken a decided turn towards the Psalms in the last few days. Arise, O God, maintain your cause. Is it nothing to you that we are perishing? Sort of between lines of, come on, God, what the heck? What are you thinking? Those chapters of Job where Job sort of lays into God, I think is helpful. And it's helped me sort of just let that anger that I'm feeling out and letting it out in a weird way, to let it out at God, who I know can take it and is able to absorb it and do something with it, has allowed me to speak the pain that I felt inside me, and is now getting me to the place where I can hear from other people in a way that I am less reactive to and can just be more supportive to. I've watched myself going from just not being able to watch TV at all, hitting mute or changing the channel or watching some stupid sitcom rerun because I can't bear to see the news, to at least now being able to watch the evening news. And I think as a community, that's sort of the first step we have to deal with. Deal with our own stuff, and then begin to deal locally with other people. As I said, the congregations that I talk to are most worried right now about how do they remain a community. They've been divided before, but this division somehow seems larger and more frightening, and they're afraid that this division is going to overwhelm them. I think to name that and recognize that everyone's frightened. And that God's in here somewhere, though God could be probably doing a better job of it all, at least from what I'm saying. And little bread, little wine. At least start with that. Doug, you probably have something much wiser to say, so I'll let you.
Well, no, I want to affirm what you said, Brother Nick. It's exactly right. We've got to start with our own feelings and our own internal state, and so. And just like you, I felt a lot of anger, and had to deal with my 3 adult children who are all scared to death after this election. But Richard Rohr's got that great saying of wisdom that he says that pain that is not transformed is transmitted. And so we need to figure out how to transform our pain, otherwise we'll transmit it. And so the first thing, just like you said, Nick, is to acknowledge the pain, to acknowledge the hurt, to acknowledge the shock. I feel like I'm living in a foreign country right now. To acknowledge that, to offer that to the living God, and then to recognize, as the psalmist so well put it, they'll always start with God. You've been there with us before. We feel deserted now. You'll be with us again, right? That seems to be the pattern of the psalm. And so where I've come to in this past week, still acknowledging anger and sadness, is these are the times that the church is made for. It talked before about these questions that we had, and one of the category of questions about healing in our churches. And we're supposed to be all about reconciliation. So this is a time for the reconcilers to step forward. This is a time for us to truly engage our reconciling mission. And the church is there for those who hurt in our society, and so those who are most vulnerable, those who are the most unsafe. I've gone back to the vows that you and I took, Nick, back in 2012, right, when we stood there in at our consecrations and we were asked those questions, and great questions. But the question that hit me that day and is continued to hit me, it's just stuck in my soul, was, will you defend those who have no helper? Will you defend those that have no helper? And now's the time. Now's the time to stand up for those who have no helper. So it's exactly what you said, Nick, to be honest about our own pain, about our own anger, to not transmit that anger, but to transform it, and maybe to transform it into the mission that we've been given.
Can I just sort of bank shot your statement a little bit and change time to season? Because I worry sometimes in a grieving moment, we don't all grieve in the same way, and the arc of our grief is unique and personal to us. And I'm struck by the fact, Doug, you and I are straight white men. It's one thing for a straight white man to say, okay, now the time of grief is over, and we don't have to be afraid, and let's get out there and do that stuff. And for us, that may be where we are, because we don't feel threatened in the same sort of existential way just by our existence that other marginalized people in this country are. I think there's a season of us offering up our fear and owning the fact that we are afraid. And for good reason. A lot of people are afraid. There's a process that fear goes away from us. And then I think you're absolutely right. We will, as a body and individually, be called, save us from the time of trial. There's whole parts of prayers that make sense to me at the moment in a way that didn't make sense to me before. Save us from the trial and deliver us from evil. We're heading into that, I think. And there will be a moment when you're absolutely right. We're going to have to stand up. So, someone had said online, and I thought it was a great quote, being a Christian in the next few years may be being willing to stand out in front and take abuse on behalf of a Muslim. I think they were a little more graphic about the swing of a billy club to the face or something like that. But and I hope it never comes to that. But I think there is a point where we may end up having to put ourselves, those of us who are able, to put ourselves between those who are in harm's way and those who mean to do them harm. And that willingness is going to look differently. It's going to look different in different contexts. It may be physical protection. It may be legal protection. It may be creation of sanctuary. It may be making sure people have resources for those who may be losing health care, those who may be losing food support, maybe going back to an older model of how the church functioned in the community.
I think the points that you're both making are so important, and I want to highlight something that David said in the chat. This division feels and seems more personal than in the past. And I think that speaks to, Bishop Nicholas, your comment about the season and how not everyone can process all of this in the same time as everyone else. So there are going to be some of us who are who can kind of get over the fear more quickly than others. But I think the church is uniquely positioned to help everyone get over it, whatever their timing has to be. And I think about how we talk about church being the place where we come in on Sunday for refreshment and to regain our own kind of sense of sanity before we go out again into the world. And I think that means that really we have to remember that we need to make our churches a place where people can come and feel safe. It's one of the few places, I think, now that people can come and feel safe. So create that environment for safety, and then also be the reconcilers that we have a history of being and that we have the almost obligation to be because of our baptismal covenant. So I think this is really some good advice and some really good thoughts. I see Sue Pullen's also been typing here about her family not understanding why she's so upset and needing to go out and meeting people where they are and listening. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what resources you think are available to help us with setting this environment where people can feel safe again and equipping us to go out and advocate and advocate for change.
So there's a part of me that wonders if we will feel safe in the same way again. And I think I just want to name that. What safety we may have felt may have not been real anyhow, and may have been illusory. It was one thing for me to imagine that I was never going to have to face directly people who hated my existence and were going to challenge it. And now I'm realizing they're all around me. And I think that's part of the grieving, that loss of sense of safety and maybe even agency for some of us has been taken away. Now, what do you do when you're afraid and you don't feel safe? I think you admit that you are afraid and don't feel safe, and then there comes a moment where, in spite of that, you manage to find enough community that you can move out, maybe not safe, but you can move out with each other, and that makes the lack of safety bearable. And that's why I think I was really struck by the fact that I've heard around the state that our church, no church was emptier than it normally is, and most of our churches across Rhode Island had more people and a lot of new visitors. Even the church where I was celebrating in that middle of a conflicted community had people who were, in the bishop's coffee hour time, not asking me about how we could lower the assessment. There were people who we didn't know asking me, what does it Episcopalians believe and how do I join this church? And they were looking for a place, not so much of safety, but of community and fellowship. And I think that is probably the first step. You don't have to do this alone. And I think maybe that's what we need to say to people who are feeling isolated. You may not ever feel completely safe, but you don't have to be alone.
Yeah, the key is relationship. So I think back to the church that I was at before I was elected bishop, Grace Church in Millbrook, and we had this great outreach to Latino people there most of whom were in that particular community were undocumented. They were from Mexico, they were from Guatemala, they were working on the horse farms in the area. And we engaged them in relationships on a lot of different things. And one of the things we always kept encouraging them to do was to learn English and to pay their taxes, because someday there's going to be immigration reform. And if you did both those things, you'd be further up on the line. There's no line to get on yet, but someday there'll be a line to get on, and you'll be further on the line. And I look back at that and say that's in the present administration, that's not going to happen. There's not going to be a line to get on. But at least in terms of my old church, people are in contact with one another. They know each other. And so it's to piggyback on what Nick said about being in relationship with one another, being in community is a big, big resource that we have. It's also, in terms of what Nick said about there were more people in our churches this week, I think that's true. And also remember back to 9/11, when after 9/11, there were more people in our churches. And that only lasted for a couple of weeks, because I think that people were thinking that we could have easy answers. Here's why evil happens in the world. Here's why people die. And we don't have easy answers. Jesus is the one who doesn't give an answer to evil. Jesus is the one who suffers evil. Jesus isn't the one who explains death to us. Jesus is the one who engages death. And so I would hope that with people who come to our churches after this seeking answers, that they find out that the answers are found in community, that the answers are found in a faithful, long-term relationship with the living God. That's what gives us life, and that our church is not going to provide easy answers to what happens. Our church is going to offer a relationship with the living God.
We may not ever have answers, but we may have meaning. We'll find meaning in, I've spent a whole part of the summer reading about the nature of truth and relativism, and I finally decided, as so many people are deciding, the real question is what's meaning and what has meaning, and less what's true.
So do we think that, and I think everything you said I agree with wholeheartedly, and I just wonder, being in community is what we're trying to do. It's what we've been trying to do. Is it more difficult now, given the fact that the language of the campaign and the divisiveness that the campaign has caused? Is it more difficult now to get people to come into community? And it is so. How do we overcome that challenge?
I think some of that might be in acknowledging what I hope we might have learned from this election. We're always saying when things happen, what did you learn from it? Something that we learned from it is that the working class in the United States of America is really angry and it's really in trouble. So I think we need to acknowledge that. We certainly need to acknowledge that in western and central Massachusetts, where we have lots and lots of towns with factories that closed 40 years ago, and the unemployment and the pain that gets caused by that. That doesn't justify people causing pain for others in terms of throwing out immigrants and refugees and Muslims and attacking people who they would think as the other. It doesn't justify that at all. But I think it's time for us to acknowledge that there are other people who hurt, and that globalization has left people behind. And what do we do about that? How do we address that hurt?
It occurs to me that God came into the world in a unique way in the person of Jesus. And Jesus walked around the world, walked around the neighborhood, frankly, it wasn't even much of the world, for 3 years and gave us some bread, gave us some wine, some water, and told us some stories and expected us to change the world with that. And there's a part of me that's finding a great deal of meaning in this moment, in those stories, and in those simple acts of feeding others, and the washing away of fear and sin in the waters of baptism. I wonder if that might not just be a place to start. I'm kind of looking forward to Christmas this year for a whole bunch of reasons, but I'm particularly looking forward to hearing that story again of how God enters into a particular moment of incredible conflict. If you've ever been to the Holy Land, that place just reeks of violence. And that's where God became incarnate. I think that's the tool we've been given. That's the stories and the act of sharing the broken body and the poured out blood. I have no idea how it's going to work. I don't pretend to be smart enough to know how it affects, but it conquered an empire once.
I've gone back to Micah 6:8. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. And so I think it's a time to what we say in Western Mass, to double down on prayer, walk humbly with our God, do justice.
I'm with Habakkuk myself. The evil collapses because evil is unable to build strongly. And I find a great deal of hope in that. And you know, this is not the end. And you know, even the news of today, on the newspaper just peaked, where already cabinet transition teams are starting to fall in on each other, and people are resigning and pulling out. If all you are doing is creating division, how can you create something that will survive?
Good point.
There's so much richness, as you say, from Micah to Jeremiah to Jacob to Job to Habakkuk to to the Psalms to the whole story of the Triduum. There's just, and then, boy, have you been reading Revelation in daily office lately and hearing it in a completely different way? I'm just astounded by the depth of meaning that's in our scriptures. And at one level, I just want to tell the stories and let God do what God's going to do with the power of those stories.
So it's such a powerful thought around storytelling. One of the things that I've come to only in the last few years, and I have to attribute this to my bishop, Bishop Rob, who's always telling us stories and encouraging us to tell stories. And I think it's through those stories that we shift our mindset from the didactic to the personal.
The narrative.
The narrative. And it allows us to see things in ways that are more personal. As I think David said before, this seems much more personal. This situation seems much more personal than any others in the past. So I think it, as you're saying, it's those stories, those personalized stories, or the way we think about those stories and how we would fit into them, that helps us through this and gives us a way out.
To tell the stories, which Richard Rohr would say, to take our little story and connect it to the big story. And then I would add, to tell stories is to create stories. I think that's what we're doing on Saturday, going to Mount Tom and reconsecrating that mountain. Create stories. Create stories that are consistent with the life-giving God that we have.
And I wonder, just to pick up on that for a minute, if a way forward here is creating stories with those with whom we disagree. Creating stories, creating experiences. And that can perhaps lead to community in those experiences. So if you have one experience and you build another experience on that, another experience on that, that's building relationship and community, isn't it?
Exactly. We don't think about faith, we act on faith.
It's midrash. You are telling a story in a new way and learning new insights as the story unfolds with new characters and new contexts.
So just want to pick up on a few comments that are being typed in, because there's quite a few really excellent comments that are being typed in, and I think it's time to bring a few of those in. One person actually asked if you would comment on, or if you saw Gail Clark Jennings' post from today about whether reconciliation is running into resistance, reconciliation or resistance, and the question of whether we really can offer reconciliation given the situation. I mean, I don't know if you saw that post.
I did read that. Also, Sean Rowe wrote something very similar a couple of days before, and there's a lot of wisdom in that. You know, it's earlier in the campaign at the House of Bishops, we talked a lot about what was going on politically, and there was this one person who talked about compromise. Not one of the bishops, but one of our speakers talked about the art of compromise. And at my table at the House of Bishops, we said, well, what does compromise with Donald Trump look like? Instead of deporting 12 million people, will we deport 6 million people? Is that what reconciliation and compromise looks like? And certainly it doesn't. I think reconciliation is on the personal level, but certainly on the policy level and the level that we treat people, reconciliation is going to look a lot different. Reconciliation has to be done through the filter of respecting the dignity of every human being.
You know, was it today in the gospel lesson in the daily office? Forgiveness is something that we individually do. Reconciliation is something that is a relationship that has to happen. It's impossible to be reconciled if there's no relationship. I can forgive, but reconciliation comes afterwards. And it may be that until the other side is willing to enter into conversation, and maybe on both sides. I mean, I don't want to sort of make a false equivalence here, but there's going to have to be a willingness to talk, and we just may not be at that point right now. And forgiveness and resistance. And if you're going to resist, I think there has to be some conversation about what resistance looks like in a gospel community. What does that mean? Leah was asking in the comment section about what do we talk about anger and that. And certainly there are young people who are deeply angry and feeling horribly betrayed. Yes. Yes. But what's the response? What do you do with that anger? And I don't know yet. I think we're a little over a week into this journey. And I don't have an answer except to be cautious. There's anger and then there's righteous anger. And one destroys you as it destroys other, and one transforms and burnishes. And that's a deeply spiritual question to decide which is it and which is which.
I wonder if there's something to be learned from something Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, said in a speech she gave. I guess maybe it was late last week, but I think her tone may offer some direction here. And she said, in essence, that she's looking for places where there's commonality. And for those places where there is commonality of vision and purpose, let's try to work together, try to offer to work together to achieve what is common in our vision. But that's the context for if things don't happen toward those visions the way that we believe are respectful of everyone involved, then we need to be ready to stand, and that's when we need to speak up for ourselves and for those on the margins. So I wonder if you might expand on thoughts on that kind of perspective as a way to move forward here.
Well, the House of Bishops addressed the poverty of language back in our March meeting, right, Nick? It was, you were one of the key writers of that document. And to raise the level of dialogue is just so important within all this, so that people don't feel demeaned. And how that seems like in this campaign that demeaning has spread out. You know, it's gone from group to group to group, with women being a large category of people that are demeaned by our politicians. And so some of it is raising the language so that the language is truly respectful language and holy language and language that recognizes the dignity of every human being, and we can go forward from there. But the words that are used are really important.
It strikes me that at one level our political discourse reminds me of the discourse you would see online on 4chan or on Gamergate, sort of the rise of the troll culture that is seeking to elicit a response and has no shame. I mean, if you think about it, normally people would be shamed by a community's response to their words, but we're in a place right now where there are people speaking who show no evidence of having any shame when the community rejects their words. And we're in a different place. as that. And when I was doing online communities and trying to figure out how to maintain some kind of civil conversation, it's so easy for people to start saying things just to elicit a response because they don't seem fully human. It's a really hard problem. I don't know that anyone has solved it. In a lot of places, we've ended up turning off comments on newspapers and blogs, and people abandoning Twitter and Facebook because of the comment culture, the troll culture. My fear is that that's what begins to affect our common communal life, our civic life in this country. The ability to have a participatory democracy is going to be, it's not clear to me that it's going to work. Which is not full of hope, I'm afraid.
Well, I think we have no. What's the choice? We have to move forward. We have to have hope. Otherwise, we have despair, and we know we can't live with that. So I want to pick up on a few other comments that have been posted here. Let's see. Nancy mentions Remember South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation.
Truth
and reconciliation. And we get into the philosophical discussion then of what is truth. What's truth for one person may not necessarily feel like truth for the other, but it may be truth, and neither of them may not be speaking the truth. So I think possibly what we can do is to help define what is truth. Truth is an important part of that. See some other comments here. Don Burr is saying educators are trying to listen and listen to the real hurt, pain, questions, and anxiety of our students, trying to listen for understanding rather than try to fix or dismiss the concern of such young and vulnerable people. Unfortunately, I've heard a number of stories, some right here in New Hampshire, where teachers are actually not helping, unfortunately. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, from the parenting perspective, how do we help our kids, our children, deal with these situations where the authority figures in their lives are making them feel uncomfortable?
I mean, it's a real problem. I do, as far as I can tell, when I've heard online or read online of an account where a substitute teacher would say, we're going to send you back to Africa because Trump's going to be president, or all you Mexican kids are going to be deported, and your families too, because I know where they all live. When those comments are reported, the schools have taken actions, dismissed or fired the teacher. So at least there is shame, and there's a line that's crossed. And I think when the church hears of these things, it's important and incumbent on us to stand up and say, this is wrong, and this is not who we are as people. This is not who we are as Americans. This is not who we are as people as a community. I've not heard that language in the church yet, but I wouldn't doubt that there aren't some corners of the church where that kind of language is happening.
I think mostly with teachers, they're trying to alleviate the anxiety of their students, and so I really feel for those teachers. I know a lot of them personally, and they're trying to figure this out as to how to help their kids be realistic and hopeful and know that they're okay. And that's and again, that's done in relationships. Relationships which maybe transcend the period that we're in. And so I just pray for our teachers, because I know that our children are filled with tremendous anxiety.
At sort of the very basic level, I mean, my daughter, it was really hard for her the night of the election, and it was hard for her the next day. And by hard, I mean really hard. And we finally just said, we're all going to turn off our phones. We're all going to step away from the Twitter. We're all going to not go on Facebook. This right now is not helpful. This sort of wave upon wave upon wave of anxiety and fear of the larger community is more than I individually can bear. Let's go for a walk. Let's go work in the garden. Let's go rake some leaves. Something to disconnect. And I do think there's a part at just sort of the basic level. It does not say the pain and the anxiety, the fear is not real, but you don't have to keep returning to the wound. Find a safe place where you can catch your breath. And that may be, again, now back to where we were, we won't be safe, but we can at least find respite. And maybe that's where we can do something, is create small places of sanctuary where you can catch your breath and heal for a moment before you have to go out again.
That kind of echoes what Nancy typed in. I'm reminded of the pastoral advice that I offer to those whose loved ones have died. Take care of yourselves. Sleep, eat, stay hydrated, be easy on yourself, and cry. And as I think we've all said, we need to acknowledge that we have these emotions. Let those emotions express themselves. That's the first step to getting over those emotions and getting over the grief and healing.
And then to practice something different, let's go back to Micah, do justice, to stand with those who are vulnerable right now, to do that in a very, very real way. But then to love kindness, to do simple things for each other, the people who are around them. I said that in my sermon this past week, open doors for people, check in on your neighbor. Don't drive aggressively, even if you're in Boston. To just live out kindness, live in a different way, and maybe that transforms our own souls.
I'm noticing in the comments people are talking about the actions that civic leaders are taking to create respite and sanctuary. And we've had that same thing happen here in Rhode Island. The mayor of Providence has been very clear that this is going to continue to be a sanctuary city. The mayor will not cooperate with any kind of government program that seeks to identify people who are here without complete documentation or undocumented. And I think there's going to have to be the place for the church to stand with the civic authorities who are doing that. There'll be moments, I think, when we'll have an opportunity to support that kind of work, however that's going to look. And I don't know if there's similar things, James, happening in New Hampshire, but I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't similar initiatives throughout New England. I am aware, and we talked to our daughter, and she was very anxious. We moved here from Arizona and from Phoenix, and I had a congregation in Arizona where I was dean of the cathedral that half were Anglo, half were Latino. And the half that were Latino were probably 3/4 here undocumented. I've not talked to them, but it's a very different feeling to go through this election and see how it played out and live in a region of the country that every state voted Democratic, and to imagine what it must be like to be in a state in the South or in the Southwest where you don't have the kind of safety. And I'm wondering what we will end up being able to do to support people who are living in regions where they don't have the kind of majority view that we have here in New England.
Yeah, exactly. And closer to home, just to really intentionally and actively engage with our churches, with mosques, and with synagogues. I mean, that kind of interfaith interaction doesn't just naturally happen. You need to be intentional about it. And so it means picking up the phone and calling the imam and calling the rabbi and doing things together.
I really believe that the points that you just made are critically important points, especially given that New England has a population that is mostly non-white. And we live in our towns, in our cities, in our states. We also live in a country. And as you just pointed out, there are people down south who don't have the majority perspective of liberal thinking that we enjoy here in some of the northern states. So from where is their help? From where is their aid to come? It needs to come from us here in New England. So I just want to hold that up as someone who grew up in South Carolina, who has experienced firsthand many challenges that we've been talking about. I'm just so gratified that we have this church that is willing to have these kinds of conversations, these kinds of difficult conversations that will help everyone over the grief and the fear and hopefully move toward action. And I see we're at our 8:25, 8:26 time slot, and this has gone by very, very quickly. I want to thank you bishops for taking the time to share your thoughts, share your observations, share how we can proceed to live into our grief, live into our fears, and live through those fears and through that grief. And consider the mutual curiosity about those who do not think like we do. Be curious about them. Try to understand how they think, why they think the way they think. Engage them in that kind of conversation, and that, as we've been saying, will start to rebuild the trust in the community. I invite you all to think about Thanksgiving is coming up. Perhaps an interesting question to ask everyone at your Thanksgiving table might be, what did you learn from this election process? How might you take what you've learned and move forward in the Jesus movement? And if you want some help with kind of topics that might be discussed, the National Church website, episcopalchurch.org, has a section on racial reconciliation resources that might be helpful to have some conversations around. Our Province 1 site has a section on the ministry section on anti-racism that has some resources that might be useful for you to read through and then contemplate about. There are tools there to help you start conversations. We've been talking a lot about just building relationships with people. There are some great tools there to help you have those conversations with people who don't necessarily think like you. So with that, again, my thanks, and I'd love to offer a closing prayer, if I might.
Thank you.
Father Richard Rohr, founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation, offered this post-election prayer for those who are hurting. He's inviting us to take a contemplative pause, to feel whatever we and those close to us are feeling, to be still, to center and ground ourselves in love's presence, because only from this place of union with love can we take the necessary actions for peace and healing. So let us pray. All vulnerable and merciful God, we do not know what is ours to do. We feel scared and alone today. We are tired of taking sides. We cannot hold any more fear or anger or rejection. And yet we know so many of our friends feel unheard and unwanted. Help us trust that no feeling is final and that you will have the full and final word. If you are indeed a suffering God, may we hold this suffering with you for those who voted for Hillary Clinton, for those who voted for President-elect Donald Trump, and for the many who have felt excluded by our politics in the many ways that we do indeed exclude. We offer ourselves as best we can to hold this love outward and open toward all, just as you never cease to do toward us. We believe you are praying this prayer through us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Be sure to join us next month for our topic, Youth and Cultural Competency, just before Christmas. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you out and about. God bless.
Thanks.
Blessings.